Ben, greetings.
Hello, Chris. Great to be with you.
Now, you've made it your business to study in great depth what the future looks like, what work of the future looks like. And suddenly, a few months ago, along comes this virus and turns everything upside down. It's been crazy, right?
Yeah, I mean, what a time to be alive. Probably the biggest existential challenge, the biggest disruption most people listening to this have ever lived through.
But rather than just going into shutdown mode, you and your team set out to create this history of the world, looking back 5 years. What did this pandemic do to the world? So let's look back from 2025 and tell that story. So tell me, Ben, what does the world look like in 2025?
Well, I think very different, Chris. I think a lot of the trends that we've been talking about at the Center for the Future of Work for many years are sort of being accelerated from the fringe into the mainstream. The way we work, I mean, the way we're interacting now is going to become very much more normal than it has been for the majority of people. I think people are not going to rush back to the office, and the office is going to be reconfigured. And going into an office isn't going to be the kind of typical thing that bourgeois white collar people do every day. Certainly, we will still go into the office when we need to for meetings or to do creative work where we still need that kind of hand to hand combat. But working in this way is going to become very much more normalized. I think travel is going to be completely changed. And again, I mean, people like yourself, many people listening to this now routinely jump on a plane to go to the other side of the world for a conference or an event. I think that's going to be changed. And travel generally is going to become not the first resort, but perhaps the last resort. So I think a lot of these big things are going to change in very material ways. I mean, just one round out that thought, Chris, one thing, again, we sort of pitched our idea with relatively recent history in mind. If you cast your mind back to the immediate aftermath of the terrible events of 9/11, one of the consequences of that was the creation of the TSA in America, and then that was copied and mirrored around the world. And overnight, the flying experience was pretty much fundamentally changed for most people. I think what we're going to see now in the aftermath of this terrible event is the creation of something you might call almost the health security agency, where to go into any building, not just a plane or an airport, you're going to have to undergo some pretty significant health screening to make sure you can go into that space. And so the creation of that HSA, we think in 2025 has probably got a budget bigger than the TSA. And you probably routinely going into a building in Manhattan, in London, anywhere, even domestic buildings perhaps, have to go through a kind of Star Trek tricorder style health scan. There might be health locks on the side of buildings. And already you can begin to see that happening in places like the Rockefeller Center in New York, where they're putting in place that infrastructure. So, we're trying to sketch out some of these possibilities and some of the things we expect to see as a reaction to the virus.
So you don't think that'll just be like taking temperature? That could be like an actual pathogen test or an antibody test or something like that, somehow sped up? Is it going to go
I
that
think
far, you
as
think?
Yeah, I think as the technology develops, and obviously to begin with, it's going to be kind of relatively crude, rudimentary, but you can imagine there's going to be more and more motivation and catalyst to create more and more sophisticated technology. And then let alone thinking about the kind of commercial opportunities that exist in building that infrastructure and then managing it and maintaining it and analyzing data that comes out of it. So yeah, I think we will, because we can't as a society anywhere in the world be held hostage to situations like this in the future. And, in a way, this is becoming very, very serious stakes for everyone. We've got to be able to move forward. We've got to be able to move around the world, clearly, but we've got to be able to do that safely. And so infrastructure technology is going to come in to strike that balance between the need to physically move around and the need to stay healthy.
I mean, you mentioned travel being cut back. How radical do you see that? Do you think we're talking like 10% of what it was before, or is it much more radical than that?
I think it's probably certainly in the 5 year window that we're kind of imagining, Chris. It probably is a bit more radical than that. I mean, certainly Warren Buffett thinks that's the case. And you look at the market capitalizations of the big American airlines at the moment. You know, it's less than market capitalization for Zoom. Would you believe? And again, in sort of January of 2020, if you'd said that, you would have been considered a crazy person. I think the reality is that many people, for work and for pleasure traveling, are not going to do that for a while. The notion of sitting next to a complete stranger for 10 hours or 5 hours or 20 hours, I think that's just not going to be very attractive for people. So obviously, if you need to travel, you kind of got to do that, and you've got to mask up, and you've got to take precautions. But I think, again, this notion of that being an easy thing to do, the first resort, go to that conference on the other side of the world for a couple of days, is going to go away, and it's going to become more a last resort. I need to go there to close the deal, to be with my team or whatever for a specific reason. But you'll have to have a very good reason to do that, and the days of the single meeting flight trip, are gonna I think are probably behind us for a while.
And how radical will the changes be to our offices, do you think? We've always assumed that you have to bring people together to have catalytic, innovative work. I mean, is it going to be the case that huge percentages of workforces, especially in digital companies, just don't come to the office very regularly?
I think, again, that probably is going to be the case for a while. I mean, Twitter have said, don't come back to the office until next year. The CEO of Barclays said recently he couldn't imagine 7,000 people crowding into an office in Canary Wharf in London or other places around the world. And again, I think what this is going to do, it's not going to kill the office entirely. You're right. For that kind of creative work, there's no substitute for being in the room with people. The eye-to-eye contact, the kind of energy you get from being with people. But I mean, in a way, the way you frame that question sort of makes the point, Chris, that a lot of work isn't particularly creative, and even creative people's job isn't creative the whole time. So on the days that the creative people need to do their expenses, or they need to do their admin, or they just need a day of catching up on emails, you don't really need to be in the traditional office, even if it's kind of a cool sort of couch-based environment. You can do that from anywhere else. And so I think the notion of the regular commutes, that kind of traditional crush hour, 9 to 5, Monday to Friday, I think that's probably going to decline, and people will do that less routinely. And I think if you net that up, that probably takes 10, 15, 20% of the regular traffic and the regular presence within the kind of traditional office away. And so then the issue becomes for big corporations who've got these big spaces and big expensive cities. Do they really need that for that kind of less creative work that people are engaged in? Or can they reconfigure that and people work at home? Or a lot of people obviously fleeing the big cities and want to have a kind of a safer environment. I think embracing that, trying to leverage those new models, certainly if you want to be an employer of choice, I think that's, again, the direction of travel that we're going to see in the next few years.
So if you frame this in terms of opportunity for someone, either an individual or a company, trying to figure out what trends to tap into for the coming years, how would you steer people? It sounds like not to go and build a traditional big commercial real estate building. What should people be thinking of doing?
Yeah, I think our underlying thought in our report, Chris, the After the Virus report, is that everything that can go online will go online. And you may think, well, I mean, a lot of stuff is already online. Technology is very big already. We're having this conversation via technology. But the truth is that although the tech industry is very large, kind of $4 trillion annually around the world, and has sort of been around for most people's lives, again, who are working today, the reality is that there are lots of areas of business activity that people are engaged in where technology is still really kind of on the fringe of how something is done. It's sort of supporting, but it's not central to how that work is done. And what we're seeing right now is this acceleration into tech being absolutely central rather than just supporting, is absolutely the mainstream of how things get done. I mean, just think about education. This is an incredibly accelerated experiment that we've got now in a completely different model for educating people, educating kids. I mean, up until January, if somebody came back from the 1950s or the 1900s and looked at the way that kids were being taught, they completely recognized that, even though there were elements of technology in that process. The same would be true in healthcare. But now you're going to see your doctor online, kids are completely online, and I think lots of other aspects of how we do things, how we get a mortgage, how we get an insurance claim, which are still sort of, for many people, hidebound in paper and traditional long-winded kind of incumbent-based processes. It's always the way we've done things. That's all being reinvented and reimagined with online, this kind of style of interaction right in the middle of it. So that's the big macro bet that I think anybody who can play is going to do well. And certainly anybody who's trying to sustain old ways, business as usual, kind of hold on to how we used to do things as we come out of this, I think, again, that's going to be a tough road, because I think just trying to go back to normal isn't going to really make sense in lots of aspects of the way that we live and the way we work.
It definitely seems quite threatening to a lot of traditional models. I mean, if millions of students discover that there are actually professors online who are much more inspiring teachers than the ones they were stuck with, what does that do to university models? I mean, you need the live networking and connection, but perhaps the roles of what should be done live and what could be done actually better virtually can be much more radically rethought. Is that what you're imagining?
Yeah, and you're absolutely right. I mean, obviously, disruption is a challenge to people with a vested interest in the status quo. And there are lots of universities in America, around the world, who have got a pretty comfortable status quo and are not going to be very comfortable in moving into these new models. The whole kind of growth of things that people will know, kind of MOOCs, these online courses, and Udacity and the Khan Academy and things like this, which again have been on the fringe, and the incumbents have been sort of at times supporting, at times not really supportive of those ideas. They're completely being jammed into the middle of the discussion going forward. And I think it behooves people to really take this seriously. If you're a chancellor, a dean, a president of university, you've really got to take this seriously, because this isn't going away. And I think the days of paying $50,000, $60,000, $70,000 a year for a in-person experience to learn medieval French literature or whatever it is, I think that's going to be a tough sales pitch going forward. But again, I'm not saying that universities or colleges go away completely. Again, I think it's the need to reinvent the model, to leverage the best of the in-person experience with the best of the virtualized experience, and to change the price point and the economics at which that's done. And again, as we know from the story of technology, the disruption that comes into different areas, it's not a good business model to just try and hold on like King Canute to the past. You've got to be embracing these. You've got to be challenging yourself, and the businesses and the universities and the institutions that do that, I think, will come out on the right side of this, and the folks that don't, again, it's going to be a pretty difficult road ahead, I think.
And there's a feature of your website that some of those universities maybe could pay attention to. This was done, I guess, pre the virus, but it's pretty cool, where you have listings of jobs of the future. I think there's 2 different groupings of 21 possible jobs of the future. Give me a couple of your favorite examples of jobs that, if you were a parent of a teenager right now, you might be saying, hey, you could consider this.
Yeah. Yeah. No, well, I mean, building on the discussion about colleges, Chris, I mean, one of the jobs in those reports is we call it a uni for life coordinator. And it's predicated on the fact that the traditional university kind of model was already changing and has been for a number of years. And I think a lot of people have come to the conclusion that this idea that you go for this immersion 3 years in the UK or 4 years in the US, and then you kind of try and make a career out of that for 40, 50 years was sort of beginning to make less sense. And how about we reconfigured that so you went to college at 18 for 1 year, and then you went off to work for 10 years, or whatever. You went back at 30, and then you worked for another 10 years, went back again at 40 or 45, refreshed your skills, learnt new skills, went back for another 10 years. And then again, maybe even your 50s, you went back for that 4th year. So you spread out that immersion 4 years over the course of your lifetime, and you could constantly be refreshing skills, upgrading skills, changing direction if you kind of hit a brick wall. And the process from the institution's perspective of managing that alumni relationship over the course of a career, the course of a life, that could provide a whole new cadre of jobs for people to do that kind of management, to manage that relationship.
Yeah.
So that's one example of a kind of a job emerging that hasn't sort of really been there because technology is changing every aspect of the relationship that the college has with the student. We think that could be an interesting job for people going forward. That's just one little fun one that we threw in, which again seems relevant at the moment.
And you've got so many other great ones on there, like kind of ethical training for algorithms, and many others, just very, very imaginative ideas that most people haven't thought of. And it does seem to me that if you're talking about revolutionizing education, I mean, it would be a great place to start is with sharing with people what are possible jobs of the future. So many kids, whether it's in high school or even university, really don't know what the future wants of them. And there's a very shallow sort of pool of possibilities is put in front of them. That seems crazy when there's more opportunity now than ever.
Yeah, no, we've been working with a number of universities around the world on exactly that, Chris, and talking to a lot of people about this notion of new jobs and how colleges should adjust to that, how they should change the curricula as well as the kind of business model to do that. But no, you're right. My travels are all around the world. I get so many people who come up to me and say, can you come and talk to my kids about what they should be doing, because you seem to have a read on where the kids should be going. And so we do a little bit of that. But no, this is a time to be creative. I mean, if you sort of conceptualize as what's going on at the moment as a kind of proverbial 400-year fire, I mean, that's something that's kind of taking the forest, taking the big sequoias out of the forest. Obviously, it's devastating and it's ugly, and if you're caught up in that, it's completely miserable. But we all know that the 400-year fire, it clears out the undergrowth. It takes a lot of the dead wood away, and it gives light and energy and breathing space for the green shoots. The green shoots are the recovery. They're the future. And I think, again, if you put what's going on at the moment in that context, then every business, every institution, every individual, every society needs to be more and more focused on those green shoots. What is the future, rather than, again, just in the metaphor, trying to sort of protect the trees that are damaged and are not going to do so well anymore.
Well, Ben, thank you. I mean, speaking of interesting jobs, the job of dreaming about what the future will bring seems like a pretty important one. Thank you for doing it so imaginatively. It's been fun to talk with you.
It's been great to talk with you as well, Chris. Thanks so much.
All the best. Thank you.